So who is to blame relative to Palestine, the Palestinians, and so on? Well, in 1956, Ahmed Shukri testified to the UN Security Council it is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria. Back a little bit. Eight years later, in 1964, Shukri, an Egyptian, became the first leader of the Palestinian Liberal Organization, the Palestine Liberation Organization, later headed by Arafat. He is also not a Palestinian, but was born in Cairo on August 4, 1929. So what was the PLO going to liberate in 1964? East Jerusalem and the West Bank were held by Jordan, while Egypt held the Gaza Strip. In fact, the PLO was not formed to liberate Palestinians at all, but to destroy Israel, and without any of the fundamental causes it now claims. Always the problem between Israel and Palestinians are blamed upon Israel. That despised country alone is castigated, basically for defending itself, while those who make no secret of their determination to destroy her are justified in their terrorism and unprovoked aggression. This is true of the UN, at the UN and world media, and even at various religious peace, so-called peace conferences. The 5th International Conference of the Sabeel Ecumenical Palestinian Liberation Theology Center, held at Jerusalem, April 14, 18, 2004. That was typical. It drew more than 600 participants from over 30 countries. Speakers such as Archimandrite Attala Hana of the Greek Orthodox Church is an outspoken supporter of suicide bombers, trashed the scriptures, rejecting all of God's promises to Israel. Roman Catholic theologian Michael Pryor described the book of Exodus as a con job, and Joshua as the patron saint of ethnic cleansers. The dean of Te Rao Katia Anglican Theological College in New Zealand, convener of the Global Anglican Peace and Justice Network, described Christian Zionism, the belief that the land of Israel, as promised by God, belongs to the Jews, as a manifest evil and an insidious presence. Israel is presented at such conferences as it is at the United Nations and in the world media as the aggressor, a land grabber illegally occupying Palestinian land taken from its rightful owners by brute force. As we have seen, those who call themselves Palestinians, a name taken from the Palestine's Israelites' ancient enemy, a heritage claimed by Arafat, claimed to be descended from the original inhabitants of Palestine. This bold scam, honored as truth, is foundational to world opinion about the Middle East. The Philistines were not a Semitic people at all. They invaded Canaan across the Mediterranean from Crete and Asia Minor and displaced certain Canaanites, just as they were eventually displaced by Israel under God's judgment. The Palestinians of today are Arab Semites and have no ethnic, linguistic, or historical relationship to the Philistines. The truth is suppressed by that UN Declarations 181, November 29, 1947, gave Israel only about 18% of the land that the League of Nations, in its 1922 Declaration of Principles, set aside for a Jewish homeland. Unhappy with being given only 82% of what didn't belong to them and demanding it all, 6 Arab nations attacked the new state of Israel with their regular armies. The invading Arab military high command warned all Arabs and Muslims to go out while they really quickly slaughtered the Israelite settlers. Then the Arabs who had fled could return to their possessions and take over everything. To the world's astonishment, the united Arab armies were soundly defeated by poorly armed Jewish settlers, and most of those who heeded the warning and fled were never able to return. War is like that, and it was a war like the Arabs started. Arabs who did not flee, but honored Israelite pleas to remain, have their descendants full rights as citizens and comprise about 16% of Israelite voters. Some are even members of the Knesset, and that's like the Congress in America. In contrast, no Jews can set forth in Saudi Arabia or be a citizen even in those Muslim countries that will admit them. Had the Arabs not attacked Israel, they could have been living in peace since 1948 in the Palestinian state. In that 1948-49 war, Jordan took and held East Jerusalem and the so-called West Bank, while Egypt got the Gaza Strip. During the 19 years that they held these territories and used them as launching pads for terrorism, there was never a word from the Arab Muslim world about a Palestinian state. Instead, they put the refugees in camps and kept them in squalid conditions, refusing to absorb them into normal society. In contrast, tiny Israel integrated about twice as many Jewish refugees, nearly 800,000, who fled at the same time from Muslim countries where, for 1,300 years since the inception of Islam, they had been brutalized and murdered by the thousands in periodic pogroms. With the establishment of national Jewish homeland, they could flee at last. But in all of the sympathy poured out for the refugees, it is always the Palestinians, with no mention of the Jewish refugees who had to abandon everything and escape with only their lives. Zechariah's prophecy and its precise fulfillment are all the more remarkable when one considers that the Arab Muslim nations surrounding Israel have 650 times the land mass, rich in minerals and oil, of which Israel has almost none, 50 times the population, armed forces, far outnumbering Israel in men and equipment, and the backing of huge oil revenues. Yet, in spite of these impossible odds, that minuscule nation has been exactly what God said it would be, a torch of fire in a sheaf to devour all the people around about. Israel has won every war, almost impossible odds. So, Zechariah also said that God would make Jerusalem a burdensome stone around the necks of all the peoples of the world. And once again, so it is. Jerusalem is the #1 problem confronting the world. It is no secret that mankind faces the prospect of a nuclear holocaust if this dispute over Jerusalem is not solved peacefully. The united enemies surrounding Israel are feverishly arming themselves to effect at last Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. Israel can deliver from submarines missiles with multiple nuclear warheads and will not allow its citizens to be massacred without using its ultimate weapons. As one more fulfillment of this amazing prophecy, the Israelite Defense Force, the IDF, are the best in the world. Were that not the case, the tiny Israel could easily be pushed around and would be a burden to no one, much less to the entire world. How heavy is this burdensome stone? Well, the United Nations has consumed 1/3 of its time deliberating over Jerusalem and Israel, a small despised nation with 1/1000th of the Earth's population. From 1967 through 1989, out of 865 resolutions to the Security Council and General Assembly, 526 were against Israel. The last anti-Arab vote was 57 years ago in 1947. More than 60,000 individual votes have been cast in the UN condemning Israel. Yet not once has the UN reprimanded those who have without provocation, waged 4 wars against Israel with the declared intention of annihilating her, nor have the terrorists ever been condemned by the UN. In November 2003, Israel introduced its first request for a resolution since 1976, asking for a prohibition against Arab terrorists who deliberately target Israeli women and children. Its request was rejected, and instead the UN adopted a resolution demanding protection of Palestinian children from Israeli aggression. The UN's adamant opposition to Israel and everything it does is in defense of the God of Israel and his pledge to restore his people to their promised land. So on March 25, 2004, the United States blocked a proposed UN Security Council condemnation of Israel's targeted killing of Hamas founder and leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin because the Council refused to include a condemnation of Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians. The next month, an Israeli missile also killed Yassin's successor, Abdulaziz Rantisi. Again, there was a worldwide denunciation of the execution of a mass murderer terrorist leader, but no condemnation for the hundreds of suicide bombers Hamas has trained, equipped, and sent into Israel deliberately to kill civilians. So, the frequent condemnation of Israel for defending herself, and the refusal to condemn the murderers and their backers who attack her, is a further fulfillment of numerous prophecies foretelling worldwide anti-Semitism. It did not end with Hitler's Holocaust. Satan has been attempting to wipe out all Jews since the beginning. If he could have done so before Christ came, he would have won his battle with God by preventing the proposed Messiah from being born. Even after Christ defeated Satan on the cross, if the Jews could be exterminated today, as Islam requires Muslims to do, there could be no second coming of Christ to rule over Israel on the throne of his father David in Jerusalem. God would be proved a liar because of his many promises to preserve Israel, and Satan would have won this world as his own. Such is not the case. More on this next time.